the first question to you is basically where we are now as in this digital evolution. How would you evaluate this process, the transition process, and what is happening to print media?
So very good question. So because I work all over the world, I would say, the place that we are in digital media, transition or no transition, it's probably the most exciting time I've seen in news media development since the internet became a factor in media. So since the 1990s, and that's partly because you see some successful transitions from print only to print plus digital. Exactly. And I say they're successful because they have, their reach has continued to grow. In some cases, even their revenues have grown. But also because there are new digital-only media that are appearing in North America and Western Europe, even in Latin America, and as well as in Asia, Southeast Asia, that are online only. And because they're online only, they're learning to tell the story in a different way. They're learning to use metrics in a different way.
Where, if we talk about these projects or these startups, where do they come from?
So there are, in my experience, at Media Development Investment Fund, we look at lots and lots of startups. We look at lots and lots of media companies. And there are kind of two big groups of startups. One are what I would call traditional media companies or traditional journalists who have an idea and then they want to bring that idea onto a digital platform first. And then you will find sometimes independent journalists who have a particular story or a particular type of coverage that they want to get out. And they will go off and create their own startup around that coverage.
Exactly.
And then the third group, and this is where you see some of the most interesting startups, is actually from people who are not journalists and are not media people, but they're technology people. In Buenos Aires, you have one of the most successful examples we call it hacks and hackers in North America, where you bring journalists and you bring coders, developers, technologists together to solve particular media problems. But that's the trick, is to find some median space between the startup technologist and the startup journalist and marry their expertise.
And what's actually their key selling point? What makes these projects viable? What are you looking for as investors?
So MDIF is what we call a social investor, so that we don't just invest for return. We invest first for a social purpose. So we invest in countries and regions where media independence is challenged, right? So it can be challenged because of bureaucracy, because of government interference, because of corporatization. It needs to have an independent editorial stance. It needs to have a regular traffic growth pattern. And ideally, it needs to have either a plan for or an existing record of revenue growth.
Talking about the audience growth, do you see also a change in how we consume media production? Is there a new type of a consumer? How to attract them? What are they looking for?
The first question you have to ask yourself is, who do you want your reader to be? True. And I say that because, again, I'm much more familiar with East Asia than I am with Latin America. But I would say that young people people that are under 35 consume media, whether it's on their handset, on their tablet, in print, on radio, in television. They consume media in a very different way than certainly my generation does. And we tend to watch it all the way to the end. And if you want your audience to be the whole market, how do you serve the two different parts of the market? Do you have a separate mobile product? Do you have a different video product? A lot of it depends on who the audience is, but the audience is clearly absorbing media in very different ways. And it depends on what the story is. It depends on your media goal. So there's breaking news reporting. There's long form investigative reporting. It's very hard if you're in a traditional newsroom, especially a newspaper newsroom, where the patterns of behavior, how the news is created each day. It's interesting. It's one of the things that culturally, independent newspapers like the NACION or the Washington Post, the Sydney Morning Herald, they all have a very similar way of working. That way of working, though, it's often very hard to change.
Do you think that, like in the future, if we talk about the automatically generated content, is there a chance like that this content would replace like the journalists, like the real persons?
It will force journalists to begin to understand what an algorithm is. It kind of goes to what a journalist's training is. It will force journalists and editors to put the human touch on stories that justify a human touch. But newsrooms that begin relying overly on this algorithmic tool will find that tool has a huge benefit for 2, 3, 4, 5 years maybe, but that eventually Google will be able to suck in all of the open data. They have a huge... and once they have that open data, then they can present the story themselves in whatever context they deem is most appropriate for whatever media you're using. It's really the context that goes around the data. If you are talking to a young journalist at the beginning of his or her career, what would be the set of skills that you would advise this person to acquire? It's very easy to forget that the internet isn't one thing. It's also very easy to just believe that everything is done by Google or Facebook. There needs to be some basic understanding of what is HTML, how does it work, what is a CMS, how does it work. It's worth having a good grounding in a particular, very specific focus. So being able to write well, I think, is an incredibly important trait. I would rather hear somebody who is an expert in civil aviation in Europe and less hear an anchor. I want an expertise. I think it's actually a huge value.